Hello everyone, my name is Boulevard, and welcome to what is normally the seasonal edition of Tournament Tactician, but obviously now the Runeterra Open Edition. So, what we've got here is the tier list, and I think these are pretty clearly defined as the best 3 tournament decks for the time being. And so what I've done is I've gone ahead and broken down all the other decks on the tier list and how they pair into these top decks so that at a glance, you can kind of tell what's doing well, what isn't, why the things are placed where they are. So for example here, Frostbite midrange, 48% win rate into Karma Set, 41% into Jack Seraphine, 51% into Leona Samira. Got all my stats here from Legna's website, so if you want to look at some other matchup charts that are not on the tier list, you can feel free to click on here. And if you're wondering where the tier list is, it is in the link tree in the description below, so you can find this for yourself. Now, talking about the top end of the meta, this is not going to be very popular. For whatever reason, even when you seem to have a very clearly defined tournament dominating lineup, which is not even necessarily what this is, take whatever you like, take it, however many people you expect to play it, and knock it down to a third of your expectations, probably even a quarter in most situations. People just don't play the same lineup as other people in Legends of Runeterra. They really value trying to throw off the ban strategy. For example, in the Mastering Runeterra Open, which was 111 players, the most played lineup was only brought by 6 people. In Top Cut, the same lineup was only brought by 2 people, and then there were 6 unique lineups because people love to switch out a third deck for something, throw off the ban strategy of their opponent. Now, these 2 decks are not doing particularly well on ladder. Jack Seraphine's only at like a 48% win rate, Karma Set's at like a 50% win rate, and when we look at the stats on ladder, a lot of the decks in the meta are actually doing very well into Karma Set and Jack Seraphine. Despite this, you will get reamed if you try to play against one of the top players playing these 2 decks. They're not the easiest things in the world to play, and skill expression is at a very high point for these lists specifically, and it is one of those things where you're probably not going to, because you're not going to see a lot of these in Top Cut, we can actually almost not totally ignore these, but look more to what the rest of the meta is going to be filled out with for the Swiss portion of the Runeterra Open. You might have to focus on this a bit more once you get to Top Cut, but I think it's safe to say that you're going to be playing against a lot more mid-range piles than you are Karma Set and Jack Seraphine specifically. You probably run into a lineup that has one of these, probably not both of these. A lot of people not looking to put these 2 together as they do have a number of overlapping weaknesses. You can see like the matchup charts are pretty similar. There's not a lot of things that are like doing good versus Karma Set and bad versus Jack Seraphine or vice versa. Most things that are like doing good versus one are doing good versus the other. And I think that's why you're going to see even more so these decks kind of pushed apart from lineup composition in the Swiss portions. That said, a small piece on Jack Seraphine. Number 1, play 2 Jack. Jack is not a 3-0 champion. Do not play 3 Jack, please. Number 2, on the topic of back alley bar, I think it was Kevor and Mo discussing this on Twitter, where they were saying, like, never play 3 bar, play 2 bar if you plan to play against Karma, play 0 to 1 if you don't plan to play against Karma. I've been on 2 bar for a while. It's felt okay, but we've seen a lot of players start to really struggle in the mid to late game when they're trying to get down bars, and either like it gets immediately aftershocked because Karma Set, Jack Seraphine are both playing usually at least 2 aftershock, either the card itself or Piltover and Tellstones as well. And then it's also just a huge awkward tempo play against the mid-range decks where like turn 7 is pretty late in the game. It can be very difficult to commit all of that onto a card that doesn't do anything immediately if you're playing it on curve, especially when you're trying to set up like BB Seraphine combos. No, it's just one of those things to keep in mind. Now, as far as Samira, this is one of the more interesting parts of the meta, where Fizz Samira is currently taking up a higher representation of like the top 16 of the Americas ladder, but Leona Samira is doing better at every other stage of the game, right? Like we've got, at the Mastering Runeterra Open, there were 8 out of 8 Samira, 5 of them were Leona Samira, and then the winner, Majin Bey, said on Twitter later that he should have played Leona Samira, he just didn't want to, so he played Fizz Samira. Also, when we look at how we're comparing into like Jack Seraphine, Karma Set, like Fizz Samira is doing fine, Leona Samira is just doing better. So the question is, do you need to be doing better, or are you okay doing fine? But the real thing that pops up as a surprise here is Varus Samira, which is not only doing better than Fizz Samira into Jack Seraphine, Karma Set, but it's also the Samira Mirror Breaker. If you are looking for a lineup that is trying to counter Samira, I believe that Varus Samira is your starting point for that. And then I don't want you to get baited here by thinking like Nora Vigar and Heimer Jace are the rest of that lineup, because again, these are small sample sizes, so this is why these are coming out on Wednesday, so that you have time after watching this video to go get on the ground floor of trying to build this pick on Samira lineup, right? That's what we're looking for here with Noxus, Varus, Samira. And that's why it's in tier 3. It's a pretty specific counter pick. I don't expect this deck to be very popular, but I do expect it to perform pretty well for the people that do bring it. It might even be one of those things where, like, you see a bunch of top players who have never spoken on this deck before. It's kind of like randomly bringing it day of when they've been, like, laddering Fizz Samira the whole time or something along those lines. It's not unheard of for these things to happen. And I think Varus Samira might be the deck where that happens. Now into the meat of the meta, which is going to be this dogfight for who's the biggest mid-range deck between Talia, Malphite, Deep, and Aatrox Vayne, and then like Frostbite mid-range just trying to kind of go under all of them. That's just kind of what you're looking at for the meat and potatoes, right? And Samira's doing pretty well into all of those. As you can see here, like, everyone's hovering around like a 45% win rate against the Samira decks, so not looking phenomenal there. I don't want you to like get baited by these numbers either. I think that mid-range dogfight is absolutely fine for the open rounds, but I think once you get into top cut and you get a higher caliber of player, you're going to see these 50% win rates suddenly swing down to like 45 or even 40 against the top players on the Karma set and the Jack Seraphine. But I think that for the open rounds, it's reasonable to not close your eyes and pretend these don't exist, but you can certainly put on a see-through blindfold and kind of just go for the dogfight, because these decks are going to have to tech for each other more than they're going to have to tech for the mid-range, at least in theory, because the Karma set Jack Seraphine players are aware of how strong that lineup is. They're good at playing the deck, and they know that if they run into someone else playing it, that they cannot be too teched for mid-range, or they're going to get bodied. I don't think you're going to see a lot of both of these in the same lineup on your Swiss run, maybe 2 or 3 times out of the 9 rounds, but I think for the most part, people are going to pick one of these and go with it. So I think like one of these, a Samira deck, and then maybe a big mid-range deck, or even just Frostbite mid-range, seems to be what players are leaning towards more often, and that was evident as well in the Mastering Runeterra event, where only Aikedo and Majin Bey were willing to go the Jack Seraphine, Karma set, Samira lineup. So as far as what I like the most out of all of these, I think if you are looking to do well into these decks as well as the rest of the field, Donut made a very good case for Deep with the just turboing out the Maokai against Karma set and Jack Seraphine, which is not the most consistent strategy and also one that is not super up to you, but it does pop off when it happens. I know Aatrox Vayne is looking very good into both of these, but again, the Jack Seraphine has a small sample size, and I just really don't like the Aatrox Vayne builds that I am seeing. I put this in tier 1 last week. I've got it down to tier 2 now. And a big reason for that is I don't think it has enough interaction for the kegs coming out of Jack Seraphine. And I really don't like how many combat tricks are being played in it. I'm pretty down on catch, if I'm being honest. I think that is one of the clunkier cards in the list, and when you see this deck gas out super fast in the early game, it's because they drew multiple copies of catch, and it didn't really get the gotcha factor that you kind of needed it to be a blowout, because you just didn't draw enough weapons for that to happen. You play your unit, you have to equip the weapon so that you can turn on all of your other cards, as well as get in more damage against some of the slower decks. You're not really having unit plus weapon, plus catch plus weapon for a random blowout on a removal spell. And so I'm just not in love with the Aatrox Vayne builds that I'm seeing. Talia Malphite's looking funky, man. I don't know why this is still sitting in tier 2. Like, I put it there, and I'm still not totally sure why it's still here. It obviously does very well into the other mid-range decks. Malphite is a solo house. The issue is that sometimes you don't draw Malphite, or you don't get on the ground early enough. Like, Deep and Aatrox Vayne certainly have low-to-the-ground units. Talia Malphite, you can certainly struggle on, like, turn 3, turn 4 to do anything impactful, because that's kind of where you're in your waiting phase to get some Rock Bears online by, like, turn 5, turn 6. So the awkward mid-game from Talia Malphite is exploitable by the other mid-range decks, and therefore I think you got to be kind of a purist on this one in order to want to bring it over something like Deeper Aatrox Vayne. I think Aatrox Vayne is probably should be the most popular sort of like mid-range deck that you should be running into, and I think it's still very strong in the meta. And then, of course, Frostbite mid-range, just doing well into these and doing a little bit better into the smear decks than you might expect, just given the lack of burn and over-the-top damage coming out of these. Then when we get into tier 3, that's kind of where we're looking at counter picks, and there are quite a few decks that I left off the tier list because they had really overlapping charts and were pretty similar in build and sort of gameplay strategy to some of the decks on here already. Like, Senna Vygar has picked up more popularity on ladder than Nora Vygar, but its charts were basically the same and also didn't have a lot of sample sizes, so I was like, okay, whatever. You know what darkness looks like. You can go Runeterra AR it, which is where I would have gotten the sample from anyway, because it didn't do well in the Mastering Runeterra Open, but Nora Vygar did, and that's where this sample list is from. Echo Jinx is not looking great into tier 1, but it is looking very good into the mid-range dogfight meta. You know, it's a board-based deck. Jinx is difficult to deal with. Echo can be difficult to deal with. They've also got just an absurd amount of attack-reducing combat tricks to play into the Demacia-style decks, like, you know, Scrying Sands and Quicksand. So Echo Jinx is still in the meta for that reason. If you're very worried about, you know, you do just want to blindfold yourself and pretend Karmaset, Jack Seraphine don't exist, and you're just looking at, like, all these Demacia mid-range decks, or decks that play like Demacia mid-range, then that's kind of where you're going to be on Echo Jinx. Alawi Swain has good charts into Karmaset and Jack Seraphine. I don't think this is a deck that I would recommend, but again, there are purists on it, and I want you to be aware of it. Elites, surprisingly similar charts to Jarvan Alawi, even though I think the decks are fairly different. They're apparently both linear, get big, beat you down enough that they have similar charts, but again, small sample sizes on that one as well. So not looking too close at this, but it is just something to be aware of. I don't think the Ashe Demacia deck that we saw take second place at the Mastering Runeterra Open is going to pop up. I think that was more of a tech choice for the weekend and something that will fade into obscurity. Noxus Forest, I said my piece on. Quinn Gwen, I don't like. I think this deck is very linear. Obviously, Opulent Foyer is a huge powerhouse card. Oh, that's what I wanted to say. So, Blinding Assault. I really don't like Blinding Assault in Aatrox Vein either right now. Please, I don't get that card at all right now. I think it's awful and did so many different things. Maybe you really need it for the Samira matchup, but I think if you're on Aatrox Vein, like, you're banning the Samira, so I don't think that it's good enough in the mid-range matchups either, which is where I come back into Quinn Gwen, because I do like Blinding Assault in this deck because of how the Scout attack functions with the Opulent Foyer, which is the main centerpiece of the deck. But I think Gwen, again, is like a little bit too linear, and just not as flexible as like Red Gwen was, where you're going to take over the meta. No, I think you're a little bit too reliant on the Foyer, and its matchup charts are not looking great, but I do think people really like this deck and value it pretty highly as a mid-range deck with some healing that can really get over the top of these, because it is the one deck with infinite scaling, and a couple of Opulent Foyers is going to pretty much solo a lot of mid-range matchups. And then Heimer Jace has been making a bit of a resurgence, apparently looking very good into Samira decks in general. It is odd to me that like Shadow Isle Control is boasting good numbers against Leona Samira after the run that I had with this deck, just dismantling Shadow Isle, but hey, I only played like 25 games, so obviously I didn't get the full spread. But that is where I'm kind of sitting on the meta. I think Karma Jack, Leona, obviously, I don't know why I ignored Set Seraphine Samira, but this lineup I think is very, very good. And if you are good at these decks, you should just bring this into the open rounds anyway. We saw Majin Bay and Aikido make an absolute mockery of the tournament scene with this lineup, just dumpstering everybody. I think these decks are very strong. They give you a lot of agency. Very good if you can play them. If you can't, or if you just are worried about getting picked on, then I think the mid-range dogfight is perfectly acceptable. My preferred style of mid-range dogfight would be Leona Samira, Aatrox Vein. And then I'm not actually super sold on any of these. I'm not a bit, like, I'd probably look back at one of these, and I think you are going to see a lot of players that are on, like, either Karmaset or Jack Seraphine, plus a Samira deck, plus one of these mid-range decks. Usually, I would assume Frostbite mid-range if we're going for the more linear approach, but I just haven't really played Frostbite mid-range. So I think that's kind of what your mid-range lineups are going to look like. I don't think you're getting a lot of, like, Frostbite mid-range plus Aatrox Vein plus Samira, but you know, that's about as mid-range as I would expect you to get. I don't think you're getting a lot of people that are shying away from the Samira. I think people understand that this is a strong champion with a number of flexible deck options on how you want to play it. You know, like, do you just want to play the mid-range Leona strategy? Do you want to go for the combo-y Burblefish strategy? Or do you want to do whatever the hell Varus is doing? And this isn't going to take away from your regional combination either. So, you know, it's looking pretty good there. But really, it's just going to come down to, like, where are you putting your Samira? Because if you're not playing Samira, I don't really know what your lineup looks like unless you want to go like these two plus something else. But if you are not running these two decks or Samira, I really don't know what your lineup looks like or what your strategy is. That is the level of nuance that as an analyst, I really don't have time to get into. That's the stuff you got to figure out for yourself. But it's looking pretty good for the weekend. This is the lineup I would run, or I might drop Karmaset for Aatrox Vein because I haven't actually played a lot of Karmaset, but I would definitely be on Jack Seraphine, Leona Samira. Those are the decks that I've played the most of this season. And then Aatrox Vein is what I've been playing since I got to Masters, and I've been climbing with it, with, you know, no Blinding Assaults, no catches, no Cataclysms, no Condemns. I'm doing some wild shit. You don't necessarily have to copy what I'm doing, but I am still down on catch and Blinding Assault. I think Cataclysm's fine, but that's just my piece on that. You can ignore that, take it to heart, however you want to play it, but that is going to do it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Boulevard, and as always, good luck in your tournaments. And while there is no broadcast for the Runeterra Open, I'm seeing what I can do.